Okay, so what can cause a change in allele frequencies? That is, what can cause microevolution to occur? Well, as we saw with the Galapagos finches, selection can. That is, depending on the particular year and the conditions prevailing then, certain alleles can be favored over others, and that can cause the population to change over time. So that's, of course, obviously a very important way in which evolution occurs. But then there are other forces that can cause a change in allele frequencies that really don't have anything to do with natural selection or survival of the fittest. So, for example, genetic drift is a good example. Genetic drift is a process in which largely chance events influence what happens from one generation to the next. So, for example, in these flowers here, we have this relatively small population of flowering plants. We've got a frequency of the red allele of 0.7 and the white allele of 0.3. Well, if, again, by chance, only, we see 5 of these individuals successfully reproduce, and it only included one of the red individuals, such that in our next generation, you can see we've got a change in allele frequency. There's fewer of the red individuals. Well, they show in the next generation how you get a really biased sample that only 2 of the plants successfully reproduce, and they both happen to be red, leading to the situation where we got a significant change in allele frequencies in that next generation. Essentially, for this allele, this population, we would say, has become fixed for one allele. So genetic drift can happen a couple different ways. For example, the founder effect, and this is where you have a subpopulation of a larger population sort of migrates somewhere, for example, and becomes somewhat or isolated from that larger population. And if by chance they are not representative of the whole population, then of course you get a change in allele frequencies in this population, and it essentially has evolved relative to the main population. The Amish are a good example of this. They're a group of folks who are descendant from European settlers long ago. They were a subset of a particular European population, and their gene pool was not necessarily representative of that whole population, and since migrating to the United States, they have largely stuck to themselves and haven't really intermingled or interbred to a large extent with other people, and so they have a very biased gene pool relative to their ancestral population and the U.S. population as a whole. We see this also with what's known as the bottleneck effect, and so in this sort of cartoonish example, we have this very large population, but then in relatively short time it goes to a much smaller population, and that smaller population may not represent the whole. A good example of this is with the elephant seal, which is an animal that was hunted extensively in the 1800s, early 1900s, and went from a large population to a very small population. And because of that, it does not have a whole lot of genetic variation because those original surviving individuals were a biased sample. Now the population has rebounded since this bottleneck, but the genetic diversity hasn't quite recovered yet. In this edition of the book, we're given this example of the prairie chicken. And so we see that in Illinois, the prairie chicken used to live throughout much of the state, but more recently its population has, you can see, shrunk drastically to not that many individuals. And so because of this bottleneck, it has lower diversity than it did at one time. And that lower diversity has resulted in some reproductive issues, and that is fewer than half of the eggs that are laid actually hatch. Whereas if we look in Kansas and Nebraska, where there has been no bottleneck, their populations are quite large, they have greater diversity, and their success in hatching eggs is much higher because of that diversity. Essentially, a small population like this with that low kind of diversity is also probably going to be a population that is significantly inbred, and that's going to have an impact on this reproductive success. So, this phenomenon of genetic drift tends to happen in small populations, can cause relatively random changes that have nothing to do with natural selection or survival of the fittest, tends to lead to a loss of variation, and in some cases can lead to the fixation of certain alleles at particular loci. All right, gene flow. Gene flow can also cause evolution to occur. So when you have individuals migrating from one population to another, you can see in this situation with these organisms that I think are supposed to represent butterflies, maybe, I can't quite tell. You can see they have a greater frequency of these white individuals relative to this population, so that as those individuals migrate in, that's going to alter the gene pool of this population and essentially cause a change in allele frequencies and microevolution. Now, this edition of the book gives us this example with gene flow, and here we have this is an island off of I believe Holland in the North Sea, and we've got this particular species of bird that lives there, and there's two separate populations that are relatively isolated, although not completely isolated from each other, and we can see that in the eastern population, we get higher survival than in the central population. And what they think is going on, but you can see that if you take females that are essentially from the central population and put them in the east, they do relatively well. And on the same side, other side of the coin, if you take individuals from the eastern population and put them in the central, they do not do as well. What they think is going on in this system is that you have migration of birds from the mainland primarily to this central population, and that is continuously altering the gene pool of this population such that they just do not have the right combination to survive very well, whereas out here, where they're relatively isolated from this flow from the mainland, and also there's really no flow going this way, they have better adapted to the local conditions and therefore survive. So in this case, the gene flow is keeping this central population from evolving and better adapting to its surroundings on this island. Okay, so now let's focus on natural selection, because again, it's a significant force causing the evolution of populations. We can think of sort of three ways in which this can happen. And so you can have the solid red line represents sort of the distribution for a particular trait in the population, and this would be some kind of quantitative trait, multi-gene trait, that in this case influences the coat color of these mice from a very light color to a very dark color. Okay, and so when you have what's called directional selection, the phenotype is being shifted in one particular direction. That is, one end of the spectrum, that is, the lighter colored individuals are being selected against and the darker ones are being favored, such that over several generations the population is shifting towards this darker color morph, directional selection. Disruptive selection is when sort of the typical type is being selected against and the extremes are being favored, and you shift from this sort of distribution, this bell-shaped curve, this normal distribution, to what you might call a bimodal distribution, a distribution with 2 peaks. Situation like this can happen perhaps when the surroundings change such that in these mice, for example, now the habitat really favors a lighter and a darker morph, and the one in the middle just doesn't do so well. Disruptive selection, as this is called, can, in extreme cases, if we completely eliminate this and these 2 groups become isolated from each other with very little gene flow between them, they can potentially become separate species, which of course is the topic of the next chapter. Stabilizing selection, this selects against the extremes and for the typical type, the type in the middle in this case. There's a good example of this in human evolution, and it has to do with birth weight. That is, before modern medicine, there was selection for sort of a standard mid-weight of babies of around 7 to 8 pounds. And you can probably think of why that is. If babies, again, back in the day were too small, they hadn't fully developed, they tend not to survive. If they were too big, birth could be a very traumatic experience for both the baby and the mom, and the baby might not survive that as well. And so there's this selection for this sort of standard weight because those were the babies that survived the best. All right. What helps with survival? Well, particular adaptations. Adaptations that help you fit in with your environment, help you survive. Example we're given in the book is in snakes, this mouth that can become unhinged, and the hinge can separate such that its mouth can expand quite dramatically and allowing it to eat these eggs. So that's a interesting adaptation that many snakes have. You can think of all sorts of examples, like, of course, opposable thumbs in primates. That's an adaptation that has given us a certain advantage over other animals that don't have them. All right. Sort of a subset of natural selection here, sexual selection. Sexual selection involves selection for traits that enhance more directly your ability to reproduce. And we can think of them as coming in 2 main types, what's called intrasexual selection. And this has to do with essentially the males competing within the sex, with between themselves, for access to females. And this typically involves development of things we can think of as weapons, like antlers, a really large body. Okay, think of elephant seals. They use this to battle each other. These elk here use their antlers to battle each other. And in these situations, really what happens is they're often polygynous, and the winning male gets access to many females. The females don't really have a lot of say in who they're mating with. It depends on which male wins the fight, you might say. Now, on the other side, you have intersexual selection. This is sometimes thought of as female choice, and it's where the females are choosing males on what we might call ornaments, and that is, so for example, the peacock's feathers. Those feathers, the longer they are, the more extravagant they are, those are what the females favor. And we see that as well in birds of paradise, many species of birds. The males are quite colorful, and they use that to attract females. The males aren't fighting with each other, but they simply display themselves and do their best to attract a female, and then the females are choosing. Okay, we'll talk more about that in class, why that is perhaps. And there's lots of things that can help maintain diversity. Diploidy, again, that can maintain recessives in a population that you won't see in a haploid population. Heterozygote advantage, certain times heterozygotes like with sickle cell are favored, that can maintain alleles. And frequency-dependent selection, which we will talk about in class with this interesting example with these fish.